the ancient, I'm going to try and sound really smart here for a second. The ancient philosopher Plato. Are you impressed yet? Not Play-Doh, not the stuff you play with. Plato, yes. The ancient philosopher Plato once wrote a piece that he called the Allegory of the Cave. And in this piece, it was all about this group of people who had always been imprisoned in a cave. They were not able to leave the cave, and they knew nothing about the outside world. All that they knew were that there were these shadows that they would see on the cave. And it was all different kinds of things that they would see, the shadows. And they were really fascinated. They would see shadows of animals. They would see shadows of plants, shadows of other people, and they kind of assumed that the shadows were real beings, that were real things, because they had no idea what they were coming from. And they kind of became consumed with these shadows. They talked about the shadows. They got, kind of enthralled. They would watch the shadows. But it wasn't until they finally left the cave that they found that those things that they were consumed with, well, they really weren't real. In fact, that they were nothing more than just the light, the reflection, the shadows being cast on the wall. And the reason that Plato wrote this, he was trying to make the point that in our lives, even in ancient times, he was recognizing that in our lives, many times, we can get wrapped up in the shadows of things, meaning that we can get wrapped up in things that just aren't the real things that are sort of like a picture of something or maybe a resemblance of something, but really aren't the real things. There's all different kinds of things that I think kind of consume us, things that we pursue, things that we really run after. Maybe it's the attractive appearance of a person of the opposite gender that catches our eye and makes us pursue that person. Maybe it's some type of business or financial success that we kind of run after, and we see that and we think, wouldn't that be awesome? Maybe it's like an experience in general that we see those things and we think, oh, I want that. And we go after these things and we run after them. And Plato was trying to make the point that in many ways, these things aren't really what we're running after. They're really just the emotions that we get from those things. And the only reason that we run after those emotions, only reason we run after all those different experiences and accomplishments and maybe even people is that our culture around us, that they tell us these are the things we should pursue. Instead of pursuing what things really are, and instead of truly pursuing the things that God wants us to pursue. In our life, I think we can do some of these things sometimes. Sometimes we can run after things in life that are really nothing more than just the shadow of what God really wants for us. Today we're going to talk about this idea, like Bob talked about in the communion devotion, about fulfillment, about what really brings us fulfillment. And I think in many times in life, we really are chasing after kind of the shadow of fulfillment. We're chasing after the shadows of the things that really could bring us fulfillment instead of really finding them. Maybe in your life it's something like the feeling of an emotion, or maybe it's a feeling of a connection. And I think a lot of times there can be a whole lot of different things for us. Maybe it's an experience that we have or something that just feels so good. Maybe it's the success of a business. Maybe it's the attraction, like I said, of a person. And we get all these different things, but the problem is that those things, they don't often last, or they change and they move and they become something else. And those feelings, those emotions, those infatuations, they begin to dwindle over time. And what happens then after that is that the pressure then begins to build as we seek out the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and kind of over and over. And we'll kind of get lost in this endless cycle of finding the next bit of fulfillment because the last thing no longer fulfills me anymore. So what do we do about all these things? If we have these feelings of emptiness, then one would assume that there must be something that really does fill us. I mean, if we feel empty without something, but we can't quite put our finger on that something, then there must be something there that we're still looking for and that we're still hoping to find and that we truly could find and be fulfilled with. Well, today we are going to look at part of that book of Ecclesiastes that Bob talked about. We're going to look at part of some of the things that King Solomon said. And in fact, King Solomon's kind of a unique guy. He was the son of King David, who was another famous king, the same king, that went before he was a king, went and killed the giant Goliath. He then became king, and he eventually had Solomon. Solomon carried on the kingdom after David. And Solomon was so devoted to God, so faithful to God, that God said, Solomon, I'm going to give you anything you want. And it's kind of funny because Solomon asks for wisdom. And I think it's kind of a wise thing to ask for wisdom. So you kind of wonder, how much wisdom did he already have granted by God, even before God said, I'm going to give you even more? And Solomon asked, he said, he probably knew that as king, he was going to have whatever possessions he wanted. As king, he could have any kind of allegiance and people to serve him. He could have any kind of possession, all these different things. But he knew that the one thing he probably really needed was wisdom. And today we're going to see some of his wisdom that he shares with us, especially when it comes to this idea of finding fulfillment in life. And so we're going to pick up in Ecclesiastes Chapter 1 and verse 16. He says, I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Solomon tries to help us understand that as he is developing and learning and growing in wisdom and philosophy and knowledge, that for him, the more he learned, it just kind of led him into more frustration and more pain. I guess maybe that's where the whole idea of ignorance is bliss came from, right? If we could just not know a whole lot, maybe we'd be a whole lot happier. At least that's kind of how Solomon felt, that he felt like the more he ran after, the more knowledge and wisdom, all he was finding was more trouble. We keep on going now in chapter 2 and verse 1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female services and had servants and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and treasures of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward of all my toil. Yet, here's, I guess, the other side of the coin. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Man, Solomon's not the guy you invite to your next party, right? You know, he's a bit of a bummer here, right? The things he says after talking about trying all this stuff, he's just like, you know what? It was a waste of my time. I didn't gain anything from it. He said, I tried it all. I tried work. I tried pleasure. I tried possessions. I tried relationships. He said, and I felt like I was just chasing after the wind. And that means that he just couldn't catch what he was going after. It was like the shadows in that story, that they could never have what they were really going after. Have you ever felt like that? You ever felt like you were just chasing after something? Maybe you were in one of those situations where you put just tons of work, tons of effort into something, only to get to the other side of it and kind of feel like, well, that's it? I mean, I did all of that, and now I'm over here, and that's it? Back in 2013, I started work on my master's degree. I was doing it part-time. I had 3 different kind of class sessions throughout the year, and I did 2 classes each, so I did 6 classes a year. I could do math. And so it took me 3 years to do all my classes, and I remember Allie was just a newborn, and Brennan was still real young, and I kind of had this weekly routine where after we put the kids to bed on Monday night, I'd go to my corner in the bedroom at first and then in the kitchen after a while, and I would spend a few hours working on things, and I would do that Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and hopefully I can be done Wednesday, but sometimes it was Thursday and Friday night, doing all those late hours, reading things, writing papers, doing discussion boards, all kinds of things to try and get these classes done and to get this degree. And by the end of it, I got my degree. I walked across that stage. I was handed a diploma. It hangs in my office. And that's about it. I mean, that's all that kind of happened with it. It wasn't like I walked off the stage and voila, I kind of magically had some kind of special ability or powers. Now, don't get me wrong. It wasn't a waste of money. It wasn't a waste of time. I definitely grew from it. But the truth is, there's probably a lot of what I gained from that degree that I probably could have learned by reading and studying on my own. But there's just something that sometimes we pursue about a piece of paper that we can hang on the wall. It says, a school said I did this. And then we get to the other side of all that work and all that effort, and we kind of have to ask the question sometimes, okay, was it worth it? And every once in a while, I get a really stupid idea and think about a PhD, and I tell Beth, to come in and slap me really hard, because I can tell you it probably won't be worth it if I ever go after that. And we have to ask that question, because sometimes we can run after these things because we have this idea of, oh, it's going to be so great, and I'm going to get so much from this. You see, sometimes there are things in life that are like that. A lot of things have big promises, but small payout. I mean, that's kind of how we're sold things a lot of times, right? It's the old, but wait, there's more philosophy. And we always are told that there's going to be so much to come from what we're going to experience, and we're going to be so much better on the other side of all these different things, whether it's maybe taking on a certain lifestyle and way of living that we want to kind of pursue, or maybe it's being a part of a group, or pursuing a different job, or even individual possessions or products or things in our life. We can get so wrapped up or be told these lies that it's going to change our life. But then there's also the times that we convince ourselves of the lies, that we sell ourselves the lies. We tell ourselves, if only I could have that relationship, if only I could have that job, if only I could have that family, if only I could have that car, that home, that substance. And we convince ourselves, if only I had. And we get so wrapped up in pursuing those things, and then they don't pay off quite like we thought. Sure, maybe the experience at first is just great. Maybe the new job is awesome, but then the honeymoon period kind of wears off, and it's no longer fun hanging out with your coworkers, and now it's down to the nitty-gritty of the business. Maybe even the relationship that you're in. I mean, let's be honest for a second. If you have been married for more than 10 years, the relationship you have now is not the same relationship you had when you started. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that sometimes our relationships, especially in our marriages, they start out, maybe there was some kind of infatuation. The looks kind of catch the eye, and we're like, hey. And we pursue them, and we develop, you like that, hey. We pursue them, and we develop a relationship with them. And over time, though, things kind of grow and change. Maybe there was a common bond that started things. Maybe something like you went to college together. You were working in the same place together. Maybe you had the same circle of friends. But even those things change. And I'm not saying that we don't love our spouse after 10 years. I'm saying, though, that the way that we approach our relationship is different. You see, I love my wife. I love Beth more than when we were first married, and I love her in a different way, and I love her in so many more ways than I did when I originally first met her. And my point is that if we find our fulfillment in all these things that change and are moving and aren't 100% consistent, then we're never going to truly be filled. And that feeling of fulfillment is never going to last. It's always going to run out. We see several times throughout the Bible that this happens with God's people. God's people kind of pursue after something, and they think this is going to be it, and they run after it, and they get there, and they're like, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And they then follow God for a little while, but then they kind of turn somewhere else, and it's like over and over this pattern happens. And we see it a lot in the Old Testament of God's people running after things or running after gods or experiences. And then we see them, at one point, God speaks to his people about this through the prophet Jeremiah. We see in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 11, he says this. He says, "But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols." He says, "Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." We have the blessing of learning from their mistakes. We have the blessing of looking into the scriptures and seeing the people who have gone before us and learning from the mistakes that they had, the things that they did as they pursued fulfillment and pursued things that they thought would fill them up. we get to learn from them. And I really think that there are kind of two sins here of searching for fulfillment that God talks about. The first one is forsaking God, just outright forsaking God. I mean, let's kind of think about the big picture here for a second of what's going on in the world, what's going on in this situation, and even in our own lives. God creates the world, right? God creates everything. He takes mankind, he plops them into perfection, and then what do? Well, we forsake God, and we look for fulfillment elsewhere in things that we want. And then throughout history, God over and over and over again redeems man back to him. It kind of does these things to bring his people back to them. But then they forsake God and look for fulfillment somewhere else. And then God even sends his son to redeem us from our sin. But we continue to seek that fulfillment and that feeling of satisfaction elsewhere. And so at first, it may seem harsh for us to hear that us seeking fulfillment somewhere else is forsaking God, but truly that's what we're doing. God is saying when you're searching for that fulfillment, when you're searching that satisfaction somewhere else, you're forsaking me, and he even calls himself the spring of living water. You ever had one of those times where you were just so thirsty and you needed a drink? That moment where you would give anything you could to find a drink. And then when you finally get something to drink, you finally get some water, man, it's the greatest thing. I've had many of those times of literal dehydration where my body went through the shock of dehydration and feeling like I was either going to pass out or I was going to lose it, and I didn't know what was going to happen, all because I needed water. And I used to be that guy that would make the joke about, well, the first ingredient in Diet Pepsi is water, so I'm good, right? Or the first ingredient, when I make my coffee in the morning, I pour a lot of water into there, so I'm good, but it doesn't work the same way in our bodies. And we thirst physically, but man, friends, we thirst spiritually. And sometimes when we seek out that satisfaction somewhere else, we are forsaking the living spring that can quench that thirst in our life. And God's saying, I'm right here. Why are you looking anywhere else? But then we not only forsake God, the other thing that we do, and when we seek fulfillment somewhere else, is that we begin by digging our own well, or digging our own cistern, as he puts it here. And sometimes we hear that and we think, well, that's a good thing. I mean, we should be kind of working to do our own thing, to make our own way, to find our own path and fulfillment. I mean, isn't that what we should be doing in life? But the problem is that what God says about these cisterns that we often dig on our own, he says they leak. They leak. They don't hold what they need to. They don't hold water. I've been down inside a leaky cistern before. My grandmother, when she was alive, she lived out in the western part of the state, out in Harrisonburg, and in an old farmhouse, probably built in the early 1900s, maybe even before that. And they had these cisterns where the rainwater would get collected in these cisterns. But eventually, over time, the cistern began to leak, and so it was me and my dad. We were there, and it was one of us was going to go down in there, and we kind of took turns going down in the cistern and trying to figure out what was going on. And eventually we had to get someone to come in who knew what they were doing and to patch up the cistern, because all that would happen was every time it would fill up, it would just leak right out, and it was no good. Friends, when we dig our own cisterns, when we dig our own well of satisfaction, when we try and seek it out on our own, man, we're not very good at it. We don't dig cisterns that hold water very long. In other words, when we're working to fill ourselves, we don't do it in ways that last. We don't do it with things that are going to keep us filled long term. So what's the solution? Well, if we go back to Ecclesiastes, this really encouraging and fun book of the Bible, if we go towards the end of it in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, Solomon says this: "Now all has been heard." That means he's like, look, okay, I've done it all. And he says, here's the conclusion of the matter. After experiencing everything, this is what I learned. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the duty of all mankind. Solomon basically says what we're going to sing in a little while about in this song that is kind of our theme today in our series, the summer worship set. He says kind of what we're going to say when we sing, "I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Man's empty praise and treasures that fade are never enough." But then we also sing, "There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing better than you." Or Jesus put it this way. In the New Testament, Jesus kind of told a parable once, or he was teaching, and he said this in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 28. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, a little connection back there, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans, that means the people who don't trust in God, for the pagans run after all these things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. You know, there's lots of stuff in what Jesus just taught there that we could learn a lot from, but I think probably two of the most powerful words in that whole text there are those last two words, as well. All of these things will be given to you as well. That means that when we give up on finding fulfillment in people or possessions or jobs and experiences, that means when we begin to find our fulfillment, when we are seeking out God and what he has in store for us, and I mean seeking God, because let's be clear, what we're doing right here this morning, this is good and this is encouraging our spirit and good practice for us to do, but this is not what it all means to just be seeking God. Seeking God is like that moment when you can't find your car keys, but you got to be to work right now. And you stop everything, and you tear the house apart. You look in everything. You open every drawer. You empty out every pair of pants pockets to find those keys. Seeking God is like realizing that your wedding band is not where it was when you put it down last night and you went to bed. You look everywhere, and you don't tell your spouse until you find it, right? Seeking God is like being on a road trip. And the low fuel light has been on for so long that it's now flashing at you, and you have to get some gas now. Friends, that's what it means to be seeking God. Not just sitting back and having someone kind of tell you about God, but us to be seeking God. You see, friends, when we are seeking God, when we are running after him, well, then we find a fulfillment that lasts in God. That's that spring of living water that he talked about through Jeremiah. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said that when we seek God, he'll give us all those things and he'll add all those things as well. To say as well for Jesus is kind of a promise. It's kind of a guarantee to us that we're going to find it. It's kind of a guarantee to let us know that, hey, you're not going to miss out on these things that you need in life. Jesus says, I know you need it. And when you seek me, you're going to find me and all of those things as well. It's a promise that so often we leave behind because we're so terrified that if I don't focus on all these things, well, it's all going to fall apart around me. So how do we do this? How do we then seek God? What does that really mean? You know, there's lots of different suggestions that I can give you. There's lots of different practices that we can do as Christians to grow in our faith, and sometimes we think that those things are what will help make us seek God, but I think sometimes what quickly happens, even with all those practices, those spiritual disciplines, those different things that we do, is that very quickly we think that seeking God is going to church more or reading my Bible more or praying more or serving or giving or whatever it might be. But what happens is that after a while, we make it all about those things, and then we're left feeling thirsty because all we care about is how much did I read? How much did I pray? How much did I serve? How much did I give? And we miss who we're doing all that for. We miss why we're doing all those things, and they kind of turn into those shadows that Plato was talking about. And we're so focused on them that we're missing the most important thing that God said we should do, and that is to make God first. Make God first. David tells us some ways that we can actually make God first. David, the father of Solomon, that we read his Ecclesiastes, and now we can read some in Psalm, as David tells us in Psalm 37. I want you to kind of hang on to these. I want you to listen to these words, really pay attention to them, and look for some of the kind of the instructions, the actions, the call to actions for us to do. Maybe even write some of them down that jump out at you and say, hey, these are some of the things that I need to do. because these are the ways that we seek God, that we put God first. He says in verse 3 now, trust in the Lord and do good. Man, are you trusting? Are you trusting in the Lord? Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord. And that right there sometimes rocks us a little bit, to find our delight in God and not the stuff that I have or the people that I have. And I love the promise that follows right after that. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Then he says, commit your way to the Lord. That means when you make your decisions, that means when you decide where you're going, how you're living, what your family is doing, you commit those ways to God. God, we're going to do these things your way. Trust in him, and he will do this. And here's that promise that always comes with these things. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. And then here's the real one I think is really hard for us. He says, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. And oh man, maybe that's just me. You tell me to be still. You tell me to wait patiently. And I'm like, no, right now. I want it now, God. I need it now. I can't wait on you, God. I need you to tell me what's going to happen. I need to know and sometimes we run after these things, but he says, do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. We look at people and we say, why do they get it, God? Why not me? But God is saying, be patient and wait on me. That's what it means to put God first. When we learn to orient and align our life as it should be in the correct order, where God is first, friends, it changes everything. When I'm focused on me, all I see is me and my problems and my shortcomings and my struggles. But friends, when we are focused on God, when I make my life about him, it all changes and it all comes into place. It all comes into focus, and we understand where and how and what he wants us to do. But I think one of the struggles in this day and age is we don't like that idea of waiting on someone else. We kind of bristle at that idea of, I got to wait on God. You want me to just do nothing and sit back and wait on him? No, I want you to trust him in your daily steps one by one. We hear this, and it's a hard struggle for us. And I think one of the biggest reasons that we today struggle with trusting in God, one of the biggest reasons we struggle with putting God first in our life is that for a lot of people, God is nothing more than just a concept. He's not a person. He's not real. He's nothing more than just a concept. And how can a concept really fill me? But when we see God as a person, sure, maybe not as skin and bones as we are, but as a real person, as a real being, that God is real. And when we put him in his correct place in our life, everything shifts. When God is first, then the finances we have from him are enough. When God is first, the relationships that we have that are from him are enough. When God is first, the accomplishments that we have through him are enough. And it could go on and on as we look at our life and we realize all that we have from God, the blessings that he has given us, are enough. And the great blessing is that that shift can bring us peace and hope and fulfillment. All of it, when we are willing to find our fulfillment in him. Let me pray for us. God, that's a tough thing. Man, that's a difficult thing for us to let go of being the one that fills ourselves up. To let go of being the one that makes it all happen, that makes it all click, that makes it all move forward. Man, that can be so hard for us to let go and let you be the one to guide us and lead us. Lord, I pray as we personally and individually think through that today with our own life, of those areas in our life where maybe, man, we are holding on so tightly, we are white knuckling it and not willing to let go and allow you to be the one who's in charge. God, I pray that you would help us to find that fulfillment and that purpose and that meaning, not in any of the stuff, not in any of the people, not in any of the experiences and the pursuits that we go after, but Lord, help us to put you first. God, I pray for that person right now who needs to make that decision to maybe let go of something. Would you give them that courage, God? Would you give them that nudge, that shove if they need it, to let go and to trust you. God, I pray for that person right now who is maybe in a relationship that is struggling and they feel like they are just being left behind or just being used up, all because they think that's where their fulfillment comes from. God, would you help them to let go of that relationship and to trust you? God, whatever it is this morning, I pray you would help each one of us to examine our heart, to look at our life and say, God, where do I need to place you on the throne? And Lord, help us to do that today. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, the reason that we're doing this series this summer is not just because, it's kind of a fun thing to see these things, but man, it's because it's important for us to pause sometimes and think about